Imagine standing on Earth 252 million years ago. There are no cities, no roads, no airplanes, and no humans. Instead, one enormous supercontinent stretches across the planet. The climate is brutal. Volcanoes are erupting. The air is becoming hotter. The oceans are losing oxygen. And slowly, almost unnoticed at first, something terrifying begins happening. Life is disappearing. This was the beginning of the Great Dying, the largest mass extinction Earth has ever experienced. But here's the strange part. Earth wasn't always a dead and hostile world. Before the disaster, life was everywhere. Forests covered huge areas of land. Strange reptiles crawled through the undergrowth. Amphibians lived around rivers and lakes. The oceans were packed with creatures. There were reefs, predators, shellfish, and countless species that looked nothing like the animals we know today. And unlike the dinosaur extinction, there wasn't one giant asteroid responsible. Instead, Earth itself was changing, and one of the biggest problems was happening deep beneath the ground. Far away in what is now Siberia, enormous volcanic activity began. And this wasn't an ordinary volcanic eruption. It wasn't one mountain exploding for a few hours. It was an enormous volcanic event lasting for a very long time. Lava spread across millions of square kilometers. Imagine an area larger than several countries being covered by volcanic rock. And the volcanoes weren't just releasing lava. They were pumping enormous amounts of gases into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide increased, other gases were released, and the planet began trapping more heat. Earth was about to enter a dangerous feedback loop. As the atmosphere warmed, the oceans warmed too. And warm water has a serious problem. It holds less oxygen. Think about a glass of cold water and a glass of warm water. Cold water can hold more dissolved oxygen. Now imagine that happening across an entire planet. As the oceans became warmer, oxygen levels began falling. Huge areas of the ocean became increasingly difficult for marine animals to survive in. But the heat wasn't the only problem. The changing chemistry of the atmosphere and oceans made the situation even worse. Earth's life support system was beginning to break down. On land, things were getting ugly too. Temperatures climbed. Some regions became incredibly dry. Forests began disappearing. Water became harder to find. Plants struggled. And when plants disappear, everything above them in the food chain starts suffering. Herbivores lose their food. Then predators lose their prey. One species disappears, then another, then another. It was like pulling individual pieces out of an enormous biological machine. Eventually, the machine starts falling apart. Meanwhile, the oceans were becoming increasingly hostile. Imagine swimming through an ocean where oxygen is slowly disappearing. At first, some animals survive. Then the weaker species begin dying. Then entire ecosystems collapse. Coral communities suffer. Marine predators disappear. Small organisms disappear. And when the bottom of the food chain collapses, everything above it follows. The oceans that had supported life for hundreds of millions of years were becoming a graveyard. But Earth wasn't finished yet. The worst was still coming. The atmosphere continued changing. Temperatures continued rising. And as the planet warmed, another dangerous process could begin. Frozen gases stored in sediments could be released. That could add even more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. More greenhouse gases mean more warming. More warming means more environmental stress. And more stress means more ecosystems collapse. Earth was effectively caught in a vicious cycle. The hotter it became, the harder it became for life to survive, and the harder life struggled, the more ecosystems began breaking down. Then came the extinction. Not every species died instantly. This wasn't one dramatic moment where every animal suddenly disappeared. Instead, the crisis unfolded over time. Species vanished. Then more vanished. Entire ecosystems collapsed. Some animals survived in small refuges. Others disappeared forever. By the end of the event, around 90% of marine species had been lost. On land, roughly 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species disappeared. That means the vast majority of life forms alive before the catastrophe would never see the world that came after it. This is why scientists call it the Great Dying. Now imagine what the planet looked like afterward. The forests were devastated. Many familiar ecosystems were gone. The oceans were drastically changed. The animals that survived were living in a completely different world. If you could somehow travel back in time and stand there, Earth might not even look like the same planet. No modern cities, of course, and no humans. But even compared with the world that existed only a few million years earlier, it would feel strangely empty. Life had been pushed dangerously close to the edge. But here's the incredible thing about Earth. Life is extremely difficult to erase completely. Some organisms survived. Small populations held on. Certain ecosystems began recovering. The climate eventually started becoming more stable. The oceans slowly recovered. Plants returned. Animals diversified again. But recovery wasn't quick. It took an enormous amount of time. Millions of years passed, generation after generation, and slowly, Earth began rebuilding its ecosystems. The planet had survived one of the worst biological disasters in its history, but the world that emerged was completely different. And this is where the story gets interesting. The Great Dying didn't simply end an era. It opened the door for a new one. When huge numbers of species disappear, ecological space becomes available. Empty habitats, empty food chains, empty niches. And eventually, new organisms move in. Over millions of years, new groups of reptiles became increasingly successful. And eventually, one particular group would become incredibly important, the dinosaurs. But they weren't immediately the rulers of Earth. Their rise came later. First, the planet had to recover from the greatest extinction it had ever experienced. The Great Dying teaches us something extraordinary about our planet. Earth isn't a static place. It is constantly changing. Continents move. Volcanoes erupt. Oceans change. The atmosphere changes. Climate changes. And life has to adapt. Sometimes it succeeds. Sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes environmental changes happen so dramatically that entire branches of life disappear. But Earth itself keeps going. The planet doesn't care which species survives. It simply continues changing. So the next time you look at Earth from space, remember something. This blue planet has already experienced worlds we can barely imagine. It has been covered in lava. It has been frozen. It has been scorched. It has watched entire ecosystems disappear. And somehow, life kept coming back. The dinosaurs came. They ruled. They disappeared. And eventually, humans appeared. We are just the latest chapter in a story that began billions of years ago. And the most terrifying part? Earth's story is nowhere near finished.